chaos defined Chicago's streets in 1892. Horse-drawn wagons collided with electric streetcars while pedestrians dodged through the gridlock. Coal smoke and manure hung thick in the air of a city choking on its own growth. Down there, time crawled at the pace of an exhausted horse. But 30 feet overhead, the future was already screaming past at 25 miles per hour as the first elevated train rumbled above Wabash Avenue. The elevated railway would become Chicago's most visible answer to its transportation crisis, eventually stretching across 222 miles of track. But we've forgotten the ghost branches of this iron network. Abandoned stretches that once connected neighborhoods, stations that closed decades ago, experimental lines that failed. These forgotten segments tell a different story, one where ambition met reality, where neighborhoods rose and fell, and where the elevated dream didn't always stay elevated. Chicago's elevation problem wasn't unique to its trains. The entire city had been elevated. Between 1855 and 1860, engineers had literally raised the street level of downtown Chicago by as much as 12 feet, using thousands of jack screws to lift buildings while new foundations were poured beneath them. The reason was simple and disgusting. Chicago sat barely above the level of Lake Michigan, and the city had no effective sewage system. Streets turned into cesspools with every rain. The elevation project was revolutionary, expensive, and only partially successful. It did, however, establish something crucial in the Chicago mindset. When geography doesn't cooperate, build higher. By the 1880s, Chicago faced a different crisis that required the same vertical solution. The city's population had exploded from 300,000 in 1870 to over 1 million by 1890. The annexation of surrounding townships in 1889 had added 133 square miles to the city's territory overnight, creating a sprawling urban landscape that existing horse-drawn streetcars simply couldn't serve efficiently. A trip from the Stockyards to downtown could take 90 minutes on a good day. On a bad day, you might as well walk. The elevated railway concept came from New York, which had opened its first elevated line in 1868. But Chicago's version would be different. Charles Tyson Yerkes, a financier with a controversial past and an unshakable belief in the profit potential of urban transit, secured the rights to build Chicago's first L line in 1888. Yerkes had served time in prison for embezzlement in Philadelphia, a fact that would have disqualified him from public service in most cities. Chicago, however, was not most cities. The city council, sufficiently motivated by financial incentives and public pressure, approved Yerkes' proposal. On June 6, 1892, the South Side Rapid Transit Company opened Chicago's first elevated line, running from Congress Street to 39th Street along the alley east of Wabash Avenue. The wooden platforms stood 30 feet above the street, supported by steel columns that would become as iconic to Chicago as the skyscrapers they weaved between. The trains themselves were small by modern standards, just 4 cars long, powered by a third rail carrying 500 volts of direct current. Inside, the cars featured wooden seats, gas lighting, and large windows that gave passengers an unprecedented aerial view of the city. The reaction was immediate and divided. Real estate developers along the route celebrated as property values near stations increased by as much as 40% within the first year. Residents of buildings directly adjacent to the tracks had a different perspective. The noise was extraordinary. Every 15 minutes during rush hour, a train would thunder past second-story windows, drowning out conversations and rattling dishes. The Chicago Tribune published letters from residents comparing the noise to living inside a boiler factory and permanent artillery bombardment. One particularly aggrieved property owner sued, claiming the vibrations had caused his piano to fall permanently out of tune. But the people came. In its first year of operation, the South Side Line carried 5.7 million passengers. By 1893, when Chicago hosted the world's Columbian Exposition, the elevated lines had expanded to reach the fairgrounds in Jackson Park, carrying tens of thousands of visitors daily to see the White City rise along the lakefront. This was the moment when the L proved it wasn't just viable. It was essential. While the South Side Line established the concept's viability, it was the Metropolitan West Side Elevated Railroad, incorporated in 1892 and operational by 1895, that demonstrated the system's true transformative power. This network was far more ambitious. 3 distinct branches radiating from downtown to serve the rapidly industrializing West Side neighborhoods. The main line split at Marshfield Avenue into 3 branches, heading northwest, west, and southwest, creating a pattern that would define Chicago's transit geography for the next century. The Metropolitan's construction revealed both the ingenuity and the compromises inherent in elevated railway building. In densely built downtown areas, tracks ran through alleys, threading between buildings with clearances sometimes measured in inches rather than feet. In newer neighborhoods, the lines ran down the middle of broad boulevards, creating what planners hoped would be elegant civic statements. The reality was less elegant than hoped. The shadow cast by elevated structures turned wide streets into perpetual twilight zones. Shopkeepers on street level complained that their windows, now shaded by the structure above, failed to attract pedestrians who increasingly walked on the sunny side of the street. Yet the Metropolitan's impact on neighborhood development was undeniable. Communities like Garfield Park, Humboldt Park, and Logan Square, previously accessible only by slow streetcar, suddenly found themselves 15 minutes from downtown. The population density along the Metropolitan's routes increased by 70% between 1895 and 1900. These neighborhoods filled with brick two-flats and graystones, worker housing that provided better living conditions than the crowded tenements near the stockyards and factories. The elevated wasn't just moving people, it was reshaping the entire social geography of the city. The downtown loop, that distinctive rectangle of elevated track that still defines Chicago's central business district, wasn't part of the original plan. It emerged from a combination of civic ambition and corporate competition. Before 1897, each elevated company terminated at separate downtown stations, forcing passengers to walk several blocks if they wanted to transfer between lines. The solution was the Union Elevated Railroad, a shared loop structure that would allow all lines to connect and exchange passengers. Construction of the loop began in 1895 and required engineering solutions that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. The structure had to be built above streets that couldn't be closed during construction. The columns had to be placed to avoid interfering with streetcar tracks, water mains, gas lines, and the foundations of adjacent buildings. At corners, the tracks had to curve sharply in a small radius, requiring special track work and limiting train speeds to walking pace. At Van Buren and Wells, the structure had to incorporate a curve so tight that trains still squeal through it today, a sound that's become part of the loop's permanent soundtrack. The loop opened for service on October 3, 1897, and immediately became both Chicago's greatest transit achievement and its most controversial civic feature. The business community had mixed feelings. Yes, the loop brought unprecedented numbers of customers downtown, with daily ridership exceeding 200,000 by 1900. But the structure also cast entire blocks into shadow, transforming State Street, once proclaimed that great street, into a dim canyon where electric lights burned all day. Property owners beneath the structure saw their rental values plummet. Buildings that had commanded premium rents now struggled to find tenants willing to tolerate the noise and darkness. Not every elevated line succeeded. The Kenwood branch, opened in 1907, serves as a perfect case study in how even well-intentioned transit expansion could fail. The branch diverged from the South Side Main Line at 42nd Street and ran east to Dorchester Avenue, serving the affluent Kenwood neighborhood. The construction was first-rate, the stations elegant, and the service frequent. The problem was simple. The people who lived in Kenwood didn't particularly want to ride the L. Kenwood in 1907 was one of Chicago's most exclusive neighborhoods, home to industrialists, merchants, and professionals who owned automobiles or employed private drivers. The few residents who did use public transportation preferred the comfort of streetcars, which ran on tree-lined streets rather than elevated structures that blocked light and views. The Kenwood branch never carried more than 2,000 passengers daily, a fraction of what other branches handled. Station agents spent long hours in elegant but empty stations, watching well-dressed pedestrians walk past without even glancing up. The branch limped along for 2 decades, hemorrhaging money, while the L Company hoped that changing demographics might improve ridership. They were right about changing demographics, but wrong about the outcome. By the 1920s, Kenwood's demographics were indeed shifting as the Great Migration brought African Americans north from the South. But redlining and restrictive covenants meant that the new residents, who absolutely would have used public transit, were largely prevented from settling in Kenwood itself. The branch closed on December 1, 1957, one of the first major pieces of Chicago's L system to be abandoned. If the Kenwood branch failed because it served the wrong demographic, the Stockyards branch succeeded spectacularly for exactly the opposite reason, then collapsed when its reason for existence disappeared. This branch, opened in 1908, ran from the South Side Main Line to the Union Stockyards, the massive complex that had made Chicago hog butcher for the world. At its peak in the 1920s, the Stockyards employed 40,000 workers who arrived each morning in dense crowds, packed onto specially configured trains with extra cars added to handle the rush. The Stockyards branch stations were utilitarian in the extreme. Halstead Station, the main terminal, consisted of a long wooden platform with a simple shelter and a ticket booth. There were no amenities, no decorative touches, nothing but the bare minimum required to move large numbers of working-class passengers efficiently. During shift changes, the platform would fill with men in blood-stained work clothes, carrying lunch pails and speaking a dozen different languages. The air around the station carried the unmistakable smell of the yards, blood, manure, and the peculiar sweet-sour odor of animal fat rendering. The branch's fortunes tracked perfectly with the meatpacking industry's trajectory in Chicago. Peak ridership occurred in the 1920s, with some morning trains so crowded that conductors couldn't physically move through the cars to collect fares. Then the industry began its long decline. New highways made it more economical to slaughter animals closer to where they were raised. Refrigerated trucking reduced Chicago's geographic advantage. Employment at the yards dropped from 40,000 in 1950 to barely 5,000 by 1970. The Stockyards branch, once one of the busiest in the system, became a ghost line, running half-empty trains to serve an industry that was already dead. The branch closed in 1957, the same year as the Kenwood branch, but for completely different reasons. Where Kenwood had never been used enough, the Stockyards branch had been used to death, serving a single purpose so completely that it had no reason to exist once that purpose vanished. The elevated structure remained in place for several years after closure, a rusting monument above 45th Street visible to drivers on the Dan Ryan Expressway. By 1970, it had been demolished, leaving only the concrete station foundations and some support columns as archaeological evidence of its existence. Perhaps the strangest story of L abandonment involves the Normal Park extension, a branch that didn't just lose its ridership. It lost its entire neighborhood. The extension opened in 1907, running from the South Side Main Line southeast to serve the growing community around Normal Park and the Illinois Institute of Technology campus. For 30 years, it functioned normally, carrying students, faculty, and neighborhood residents. Then came public housing. In the 1950s, the Chicago Housing Authority embarked on an ambitious plan to clear slums and replace them with modern high-rise public housing projects. The neighborhoods around the Normal Park extension were targeted for redevelopment. Between 1954 and 1958, hundreds of buildings were demolished and thousands of residents displaced. The new high-rises that replaced them housed similar numbers of people, but in a completely different configuration, vertically concentrated rather than spread across a neighborhood. The L stations, designed to serve a dispersed population living in 2- and 3-story buildings, suddenly found themselves poorly positioned relative to the new high-rises. A station might be 3 blocks from the nearest project building, a walk that felt considerably less safe in the increasingly isolated landscape created by the towers. Ridership collapsed. The CTA responded by reducing service, which further reduced ridership, which led to more service cuts, creating the classic transit death spiral. The Normal Park extension closed in 1973, but its physical remains told an unusual story. Because the structure ran through what was now largely vacant land between housing projects, there was no pressure to demolish it. For decades, the elevated tracks remained, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Trees grew up through the gaps in the structure. Vines covered the support columns. Birds nested in the station houses. Urban explorers discovered the abandoned line in the 1990s and documented stations where ticket booths still contained fare charts from the 1970s and where waiting room benches sat exactly where passengers had last used them. The story of the Humboldt Park branch illustrates how infrastructure decisions made during crises can shape cities for decades. In 1895, the Metropolitan West Side Elevated needed to reach the rapidly growing Humboldt Park neighborhood. But they faced a problem. They didn't own the right-of-way for their preferred route. The solution was a temporary detour along existing streets with the intention of building a proper direct route once they secured the necessary property rights. The temporary route opened on May 6, 1895. It was indirect, slow, and operationally inefficient, requiring sharp curves and steep grades that limited train speeds and increased wear on equipment. But it worked well enough that the company kept postponing construction of the permanent route. Years became decades. The temporary routing solidified as buildings oriented themselves toward the stations, as pedestrian traffic patterns developed around the elevated structure, as businesses established themselves with the assumption that the L would always be exactly where it was. By the time the CTA finally built a more direct route in 1951, the old Humboldt Park branch had been operating for 56 years. The new route reduced travel times by 7 minutes and eliminated several dangerous curves, but it also bypassed 3 stations on the old alignment. Those stations, Noble, Paulina, and Levitt, closed overnight when service shifted to the new tracks. The 3 station houses remained standing for years, gradually deteriorating. Paulina Station, the last to be demolished in 1967, had become a symbol of something urbanists were just beginning to recognize. Infrastructure creates its own geography, and changing that infrastructure means destroying the patterns of life that had grown around it. The old Humboldt Park branch right-of-way presented a unique challenge. It ran through dense neighborhoods, where the elevated structure was the only open space. Community groups proposed converting it into an elevated park, anticipating the High Line in New York by 50 years. The idea gained no traction. Instead, the structure was methodically demolished between 1952 and 1954, leaving behind only the support columns, which stood for another decade before they too were removed. Today, nothing visible remains except for subtle changes in building heights and orientations that hint at where the structure once stood. Not all abandoned L infrastructure was actually built. The proposed Ravenswood Lake Shore Drive connection represents one of Chicago's great unrealized transit visions. In 1929, transit planners proposed extending the Ravenswood line, now the Brown Line, eastward to connect with a new elevated line that would run up Lake Shore Drive, providing rapid transit service along the lakefront from downtown to Rogers Park. The logic was sound. Lakeshore Drive was already becoming congested with automobile traffic, and the neighborhoods immediately west of the drive had no convenient rapid transit access. The proposal included 12 new stations, 4 miles of new elevated structure, and a projected ridership of 80,000 passengers daily. Engineering studies were completed. Architectural drawings were prepared showing elegant Art Deco station designs. The estimated cost was $12 million, expensive but not impossible. Then came October 1929 and the stock market crash. The Depression destroyed not just the funding for the Ravenswood connection, but the entire logic behind it. Ridership on existing lines plummeted as unemployment soared. Real estate development along the lakefront stopped completely. The political will to undertake expensive new transit construction evaporated. The Ravenswood connection was shelved, officially postponed, pending improved economic conditions. Those improved conditions never arrived, at least not in a form that revived the proposal. After World War II, automobile ownership surged, making elevated transit along a scenic drive seem less appealing to planners increasingly focused on accommodating cars. The concept was periodically revived. In 1949, in 1962, in 1974, but each time it foundered on cost concerns and changing transit priorities. Today, the lakefront communities that would have been served by the Ravenswood connection remain among the most transit-inaccessible neighborhoods in Chicago, a gap in the system that represents a ghost of a line never built. By 1960, the Chicago L system had reached both its maximum extent and the beginning of its long contraction. The network comprised 214 miles of track and served 180 stations. But the forces that would shrink it were already in motion: suburbanization, white flight, highway construction, and the general American abandonment of public transit in favor of private automobiles. The closures came in waves. The first wave, in the late 1950s, eliminated branches that served declining industrial areas or neighborhoods undergoing demographic upheaval. The Kenwood branch, the Stockyards branch, the Humboldt Park extension. These closures made operational sense. The branches were hemorrhaging money, but they also created a self-reinforcing cycle. Neighborhoods that lost L service became less accessible, accelerating their decline, which justified further service cuts. The second wave of closures came in the 1970s and early 1980s, as the CTA faced severe budget crises. These weren't surgical removals of obviously failing branches, but desperate cost-cutting that sometimes eliminated perfectly functional infrastructure. The Niles Center Skokie Swift temporarily closed. Several downtown loop stations were shuttered to save on staffing costs. Entire platforms at other stations were closed, reducing capacity just as planners were beginning to recognize that accommodating automobiles had been a mistake. What's remarkable is that the contraction eventually stopped and partially reversed. The Orange Line to Midway Airport opened in 1993, the first major new L line in decades. The Brown Line was extended to Kimball in 1907. Wait, that's backwards. The Brown Line was extended north in 2009. The Red Line was extended south. Closed stations downtown were reopened as ridership recovered. Today, the L system carries more passengers than it did in 1960, though on a smaller network. Chicago's abandoned L infrastructure exists in layers of visibility. Some is completely gone, removed so thoroughly that only archival photographs prove it ever existed. Some remains as obvious ruins, station houses converted to other uses, support columns standing inexplicably in parking lots, stretches of embankment where the tracks once ran. And some is hidden in plain sight, visible only if you know what to look for. The Paulina Connector, a never-completed link between the Blue Line and the Milwaukee Road tracks, exists as a concrete ramp leading to nothing. Sprouting weeds beside the Kennedy Expressway. The foundations of the old Stockyards branch stations are still visible beneath 45th Street if you look carefully at the pavement patterns. Several buildings downtown retain structural modifications made to accommodate L tracks that no longer run past them. Reinforced walls, bricked-over archways, and mysterious projecting brackets that once supported track. Urban explorers and transit historians have documented these remnants obsessively. Online forums feature hundreds of photographs of abandoned stations, mapping projects that trace every closed branch, and speculation about why particular infrastructure was removed while other pieces remained. There's something compelling about this archaeology of the recent past. These monuments to decisions made by our grandparents and great-grandparents, decisions that shaped the city we inherited. The most haunting remnants are the ones that almost worked. The Garfield Park Line's original routing, replaced in the 1950s by the Congress Line, left behind station houses that stood for decades as deteriorating sentinels above West Side streets. The last one, at Homan Avenue, wasn't demolished until 2002. For 50 years it stood there, windows broken, platform deteriorating, while tens of thousands of commuters passed beneath it daily on the new Congress Line, mostly unaware that they were driving past the ghost of the route they would have taken if they'd lived one generation earlier. Stand at the corner of 45th and Halsted today, and nothing about the landscape suggests that this was once one of Chicago's busiest transit nodes. The Union Stockyards are gone, replaced by an industrial park that bears little resemblance to the sprawling complex that once employed thousands. The elevated tracks that served those thousands are gone too, leaving only a slight irregularity in the pattern of telephone poles along Halsted. They're spaced differently here, positioned to avoid the support columns that once stood between them. This is the paradox of abandoned infrastructure in a living city. It disappears not through dramatic demolition, but through a gradual process of removal, reuse, and forgetting. The metal from demolished L structures was recycled into new construction. The land beneath them was reclaimed for other uses. The buildings that once oriented themselves toward L stations reoriented toward whatever replaced them. Bus stops, parking lots, the simple geometry of a street grid no longer interrupted by elevated tracks. Yet the geography of the abandoned lines persists in subtle ways. Neighborhoods that grew up around L stations retain the density patterns those stations created, even decades after the stations closed. Commercial districts still cluster at intersections where stations once stood, serving pedestrian traffic patterns that outlasted the infrastructure that created them. The city's shape remembers what the city's surface has forgotten. For Chicago, a city that literally raised itself out of a swamp and built a second city after the first burned down, this continual rebuilding and abandonment is less exceptional than typical. The elevated lines, both the ones that survive and the ones that don't, represent just one layer in a palimpsest of urban infrastructure. The tunnels beneath them, the streetcar tracks beneath those, the raised streets beneath those, and the original grade beneath that. Each layer tells a story about the city at a particular moment, about what Chicagoans needed, what they valued, and what they were willing to build or abandon to get it. The abandoned L lines are part of that story, ghost chapters in a narrative that continues to be written overhead, in the rattle and squeal of trains that still run where other trains used to go. serving stations that replaced stations, following routes chosen when other routes failed. Above the streets, the iron skeleton still moves, still changes, still grows in some places and contracts in others, a mechanical organism adapting to the living city beneath it.